Long before America took shape, long before Europe became a compass for empires, and well before kings etched their legacies into stone, the practice of slavery had already woven itself into the very fabric of human society. The oldest clay tablets artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia speak to a time when humans were classified as property. The Quran too discusses captives taken in conflict, while the ancient Indian Vedas delineate a caste system that relegated some individuals to serve while designating others for power. From the arid deserts of Mesopotamia to the fertile fields of ancient China and the ruthless raids of the Vikings, every civilization on earth has engaged in slavery. Every ethnic group, every empire, and every individual living today can trace their lineage back to those who either survived this plight or witnessed its horrors. Yet, despite this universal history, the modern narrative often insists that only one chapter holds significance, only one group's suffering is deemed worthy of remembrance, while the stories of countless others fade into obscurity. Why is this the case? If every race has faced slavery and each empire has practiced it, why do we only focus on a singular story? Who determines the hierarchy of suffering? What motives lie beneath the surface of this selective remembering? Today, we will explore these vital questions and strive to uncover the broader truths hidden within history. Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, a Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and in this episode of Forgotten History we will delve into the nuances of slavery's past. Slavery's origins can be traced back to the moment that early human tribes comprehended their ability to force another group into servitude. The clay tablets originating from ancient Mesopotamia, dating back approximately 4,000 years before Christ, already contained laws regulating the treatment of slaves, debt obligations, and the status of captives taken in warfare. Thus, by the time humanity developed the means to record its history, slavery was not an innovation but an ancient practice. In Egypt, long before the story of Moses began, foreign captives were marched into quarries and mines, forced to build the opulence associated with Pharaoh's men who believed their authority was divinely sanctioned. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley, the Vedas established rigid social hierarchies that would eventually crystallize into the caste system, condemning entire families to a life of servitude from birth, with no hope of escape or ascension. Across China during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, war captives and criminals were treated as property, branded, sold, and passed down through generations. This cycle of bondage stripped entire households of their individual identities while embedding their fates within those of their owners. The patterns were alarmingly familiar. In Greece, slaves toiled in the brutal silver mines of Lorien, where many did not survive long enough to see their freedom. And in the heart of Rome, a staggering 1/3 of its population were enslaved at the height of the empire. Gauls, Germans, Greeks, and Jews all were vulnerable to the legions of Rome, who could march them back home in chains. And similarly, as had been the case in many ancient societies, the children of slaves were automatically consigned to slavery themselves. Across Africa, well before European vessels ever reached its shores, powerful kingdoms took captives from rival tribes, sometimes for manual labor, sometimes for ritual sacrifice, and occasionally for trade. Slavery was not an alien concept introduced by Europeans. It was intricately woven into the political and economic structures of the region. The emergence of Islam in the Middle East did not eliminate slavery, but rather regulated it. The Quran discusses the treatment of prisoners and the rights of slaves alongside the conditions that would enable their manumission. The Arab slave trade persisted for over a millennium, transporting millions of individuals, including Africans, Persians, Slavs, and Greeks over vast distances. Every corner of the globe hides a version of this story, a record of who wore chains and who wielded power. Slavery was neither an invention of the West nor a phenomenon restricted to Europeans. It existed ubiquitously across multiple civilizations. By the time European ships first crossed the Atlantic, the institution of slavery was already ancient. spanning thousands of years and manifesting throughout nearly every society on the planet. Slavery did not merely survive beyond the ancient world. It evolved into a towering industry. Consider one of its largest systems, operational long before the Atlantic slave trade began. In the marshlands of southern Iraq in the year 869 AD, approximately 500,000 African slaves, known as the Zanj, revolted against the Abbasid Caliphate uprising that became one of the largest slave rebellions in recorded history. These men had been transported from East Africa to work on plantations near Basra, laboring under conditions so intolerable that most perished within a few short years. Their rebellion spanned 14 years, decimating entire cities, claiming tens of thousands of lives. Men from Nubia, Abyssinia, women from the Swahili coast, and boys from the Horn of Africa suffered horrific fates, often castrated for their value. Their captives were delivered to the slave markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Middle East. Genoese merchants operating out of Kaffa in Crimea exported over 10,000 slaves annually at their zenith. Anatolian traders procured Circassian and Georgian boys to serve in the Mamluk armies of Egypt, while Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad of Egypt filled his ranks with young warriors sourced from the Mongol Golden Horde, creating a military elite reliant on enslaved boys from the Black Sea region. Continuing into Central and West Africa, the practices of slavery predated European contact. In the Kingdom of Congo, King Alfonso I corresponded with Portugal during the early 1500s, lamenting how neighboring Ndongo tribes emptied entire villages in their mad quest for captives. Studies suggest that prior to European involvement, approximately 12 to 14% of West Africa's total population existed in some form of servitude. These practices were not isolated or tribal, but systemic and state-sanctioned across the continent. In North America, long before Columbus arrived, the indigenous tribes, such as the Haida and the Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest, regularly captured rivals in warfare. Roughly a quarter of all households engaged in the practice of enslavement, taking captive individuals from the Salish and Shalanooth tribes. In the regions identified today as the American Southwest and Great Plains, the Comanche constructed a raiding empire, seizing thousands of Apaches, Utes, Navajos, and even Mexican captives over the centuries. In central Mexico, the Aztec markets of Tlatelolco routinely sold slaves alongside food, while in the Andes, the Incas enforced the labor tax known as mita, requiring up to 30% of adult males to work in agriculture, mining, and construction. Slavery was not an anomaly. In fact, it was a normalized aspect of life across the Americas. Then emerged the Barbary States, where the final brutal slave system existed before the Atlantic slave trade solidified. From the 1500s to the 1800s, the regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, alongside the Sultanate of Morocco, unleashed pirate fleets across the Mediterranean, commanded by notorious captains like Hayreddin Barbarossa. These raiders captured vessels and assaulted coastal European towns as far north as Iceland. The 1627 raid on Iceland alone resulted in the enslavement of approximately 400 individuals, primarily women and children. In Algiers, between 25,000 and 35,000 slaves were held at any one moment, amounting to an estimated 1.5 million Europeans enslaved over the course of 3 centuries. Italians, Spaniards, Dutch, Greeks, Irish, and even Americans. When the USS Philadelphia ran aground off Tripoli in 1803, the entire crew was captured and enslaved. This event ignited the First Barbary War under President Thomas Jefferson, followed by a Second Barbary War under President James Madison, the first foreign wars in American history waged, not for territorial gain but to combat the enslavement of American citizens. By the time European empires set foot on the West African coastline, the machinery of enslavement was already extensive. The world did not discover slavery with the Atlantic. Instead, the Atlantic world inherited a pre-existing institution. The Atlantic slave trade was not birthed in isolation. It emerged from a vast global network that had persisted for millennia. However, what distinguished the Atlantic slave trade was the context of its existence. This marked the first significant clash between slavery and a new era characterized by expansive navigation, transoceanic trade, and organized bureaucratic systems. European nations did not create the slave ship. They merely scaled the operation globally. Portugal commenced its slave purchasing from West African kingdoms in the 1440s, with Spain, the Netherlands, France, and England quickly following suit. Between the 1500s and 1800s, approximately 12.5 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic, with about 10.7 million surviving the arduous voyage. However, here's an aspect often overlooked. The vast majority of these enslaved individuals did not arrive in what is now the United States. Nearly 5 million were sent to Brazil alone, almost half of the total. Atlantic slave trade, while around 4 million were shipped to Caribbean plantations under various European colonial powers. Yet historical records affirm that thousands existed from as early as the 1600s onward. This reality highlights an aspect frequently overlooked in contemporary narratives. Slavery was motivated more by economic drivers than ideological purity. Yet the principles of supply, demand, labor needs, and fundamentally, profit dictated the landscape, which allowed for the existence of freed black populations. This proximity makes the Atlantic experience feel more immediate, palpable, and deeply personal even for those alive today whose great-grandparents were born into slavery. Finally, there is the matter of documentation. The Atlantic trade was meticulously recorded. Ledgers, manifests, and newspapers provide a wealth of data. Arab traders often subjected non-Muslims to an underclass status for extended periods, treating them akin to slaves. The Atlantic system did not emerge in a vacuum. It thrived in a world irrevocably shaped by the historical continuity of slavery. For millennia, slavery has coursed through every civilization on Earth like a relentless tide. Empires have risen and fallen, religions have flourished and fragmented, borders have shifted, and languages have vanished, but slavery has persisted. It endured through the Roman Empire, through caliphates under the Mongols, in Viking conquests, and within the nations of Africa and the Americas. Slavery has weathered all the storms humanity has faced. Then, in an unprecedented turn, a civilization arose determined to declare slavery not merely an unfortunate existence or a consequence of warfare, but an unequivocally moral aberration. The campaign against slavery originated in Britain. In 1807, the British Parliament outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, not slavery itself, but the act of buying and transporting humans as commodities. For the next 60 years, Britain devoted approximately 2% of its entire national income to intercepting slave ships off the coast of Africa. British naval forces liberated captives, boarded slavers, and destroyed vessels. In certain years, the West Africa Squadron managed to free more Africans than were being transported by the entirety of the slave trade. This marked a historic moment when a nation used its military might not to expand slavery but to dismantle it. Other nations began to follow suit, with France, Portugal, Spain, and eventually even the Ottoman Empire pledging to reduce their participation. Gradually, the world began moving away from a system that had been part of life since time immemorial. However, the most significant and brutal reckoning would ultimately unfold within the borders of the United States. By the mid-1800s, America found itself deeply divided, one half industrial, the other agrarian, one half turning away from slavery, the other resolute in its commitment to the institution. The U.S. Civil War morphed into a crucible for the nation's identity, with slavery at its very core. Four years later, the war concluded with an estimated 620,000 fatalities. It's more than all American deaths from World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Among those, roughly 360,000 died on the Union side, the majority of whom were white. In total, nearly 500,000 white Americans lost their lives, fighting not just to preserve the Union, but ultimately to dismantle slavery. This sacrifice marked the largest loss of life any nation had ever endured to abolish its own system of enslavement. When the war ended in 1865, and the 13th Amendment was ratified, the United States took a monumental step towards unshackling itself from the chains of its past. The enduring legacy of slavery would continue to shape the nation, but the collective memory of struggle, sacrifice, and reform we inherited reveals not merely the consequences of bondage but the possibility of redemption and renewal.